Thank you very much, Hamish, and welcome, and thank you very much for coming out today. It's great. So I'm going to be, the reason I'm talking to you is that you've got here at the Aigantighe 2 paintings, which I haven't even seen one of them, and they're still covered. I have seen the other, but I haven't seen one. And they came from Rewi, the New Zealander who I'm going to talk about today, and I'll talk about his art collecting and try and contextualise how these possibly came here. So these are here. They came in 1973, so I think that's interesting as well as a date, and I'll talk about that later on. They were gifted by the Timaru Chinese Association, which I'm just learning about, but I think we can try and patch together something about the history of these, and actually possibly some of you can help, so that'll be useful. But first of all, I'm going to talk about Ali and his collecting and what the purposes that he had for his art collecting and what he thought, what he hoped to achieve with them. So many of you, of course, will know Rewi, Canterbury person. It's interesting, everybody who's older, of course, has heard of him, but young people haven't. So my students, no one's heard of him, but of course, anybody who's old has heard of him. He was born in Springfield, in Canterbury. His family were a quite big education family. His father was a principal. He became the principal of a big primary school in Christchurch, Whoronui Primary School. And Ali went to Boys High, went to the First War, came back on the soldier resettlement program, where he was put on a place in Taranaki, which was bush, with another bloke, and they worked on this land, and he was there for 6 years, and they never really, half broke it in, and then there was the slump in the mid-20s, and he walked off the land, and in 1927 he got a boat to China, and don't know why he went to China. It was never really explained. He did meet, when he was fighting in the First War, there were Chinese working in France, Chinese labour guys working in France. They were digging trenches and stuff, and his first Chinese people he met were there. Also, his mother was very liberal, and she had, so I understand, there were, a lot of people came through the house, and there may have been Chinese people that he met through the family. Whatever. He ended up in China in 1927 and in Shanghai. And he got a job as a fireman in Shanghai, and then he became, in 1931-32, he had started to learn Mandarin, and he became because he could speak some Chinese by that stage, he became a factory inspector. So it was a branch of the fire department, but he would go around inspecting factories and checking on their health and safety, of which there wasn't a lot. And of course there was child exploitation and awful things, and he tried, that was what he was dealing with. He got an interest in Chinese culture and arts at a very early point. So we've got letters right from 1928 when he's starting to attend lectures at the YMCA given on Chinese culture, and the Asiatic Society had lectures, and there were some quite good lecturers that came through. And he early on started to get an interest, and he said in letters, I'm starting to go to the curio shops and starting to pick up the odd thing. Goodness, this is fascinating, this culture and things like this. Anyway, he fell in with the Communist Party, the new Communist Party, which started in Shanghai. And by 1936, the Japanese had come down to Shanghai, were invading, coming down into China, and his position in Shanghai had become tenuous, and he had to leave. He was, many of you will know, he was instrumental in this movement called the Industrial Cooperatives Movement, bit of a mouthful, Indusco, which was a movement which set up industry, small industries across China, away from the coast, where it was away from Japanese, and they manufactured goods which were used in the war of resistance against Japan. So ammunitions and clothing and all sorts of things that would, and I think at the biggest they had 100,000 people. It was quite a big organisation, and he was instrumental in that. He was really quite central to that movement, and it attracted a lot of international aid from America. The New Zealand government used to give there was a grant, annual grant, because Ali talked them into it, and then they started up a school. They set up several schools, Bailey schools they were called, after an American hero of his. And the long and the short of it was he ended up being the principal of one of these schools. Out here in Shandong province, Gansu province, in a town called Shandong, which is about in the narrow part of Gansu province here. It's on the edge of the Gobi Desert. And he ended up in 1946 being the principal of that school. And it was training boys and I think it was only boys as I recall, training boys to work in the, so they could, lead this movement and these factories. So he was out here, and then of course 1949, Communist Revolution, and he stayed there until 1952 when the Chinese government told him to come to Beijing and to be the lead delegate for a peace conference, which I'll talk about shortly, which was in Beijing. He lived in Beijing for the rest of his life, died in 1987. So we know that's his life. We know that he was interested in arts from a very early period. For example, this painting was given to him in 1934 when he changed within his unit, and the colophon, this is at Canterbury Museum. Most of these objects are in Canterbury Museum, which I'll talk about that collection and how that collection came to be there. But the colophon says, we know that you're very interested in Chinese painting and calligraphy. Therefore, we've commissioned this scroll from this famous painter, Jiang Sizhi. Well, we have not been able to find that painter. He wasn't that famous because he's just not mentioned anywhere. But anyway, it's a nice painting, and his colleagues who gave it to him signed their names and put their seals up here. So he had taken an interest in art from a very early period. He visited New Zealand for the first time, came back in 1932, and he brought with him objects, and he donated them to Canterbury Museum. He only brought about 30 objects with him at this point, and so he started this habit of bringing material back from China and gifting it, most of it to Canterbury Museum, but also to other places. And some of the objects which came in 1932 were, for example, this helmet from the Mongol dynasty, which was stolen from the museum about 25 years ago. It was stolen, and then it was recovered. So now it's in this, this case which is all wired up and, etc. So they're quite rare in China. Then actually the biggest number of these are in Japan, because when the Mongols tried to invade Japan twice and were defeated, but not defeated by the Japanese, the storms came up, and so a lot of those helmets have been recovered in Japan, actually. Here's another thing that came in 1932, a Bodhisattva. It's actually hollow underneath, and it's got inside it the little scrolls with the little little writing on them, on material. That's interesting. He came back in 1937 as well and brought about 100 objects with him, which he just gifted to Canterbury Museum. And that is a Sogdian dancer, a man from Sogdiana, which is in modern-day Uzbekistan. So it's on the Silk Road, and these people came to the Tang Dynasty court and entertained, and there are representations of them, and they were dancers, and so he's doing the swirl on one leg, swinging around. So this arm, which is broken, would be up here, and you see his cloak swirling out, and he's lifting his foot. He's a foreigner, so he's got a big nose, big eyes, and a beard, and a pointed hat. So that's the Central Asian for the Chinese. When he went to Shandan out there in the Gobi Desert, it was a really in the back of beyond. I mean, it's still pretty out there. I've been there, and it's still a long way from anywhere. But in those days, it must have felt like, really nowhere. It's right on the edge of the Gobi Desert. Courtney Archer, who was a man from Rangiora, went and worked. There are a few New Zealanders who went and worked at that school with Ali. Archer, fortunately, his partner is still alive in Rangiora and has his photo collection and etc., which we've had access to. And so that's a photo from his collection. There was a pagoda there from the Emperor Ashoka period. So that's which was still standing. There was an earthquake in Shandan. I think it was 52 or 54. I think it was 1954. And a lot of this material fell down. There was a beautiful city wall, and that has gone, the pagoda. So amazing. It was standing until just recently. And Archer, who was he was sort of loosely associated with the group, the artistic people in Christchurch. Leo Bentzman painted him. He was an amateur painter, and so there's a nice little collection of his works, and he painted that pagoda. That's what it looks like today, Shandan. So you can that it's still fairly, you do feel you're in the middle of nowhere a wee bit. So Ali, so he worked there, and because it was on the Silk Road, it was in what's called the Gansu corridor. It was a good place for collecting. Material was being found. You could buy stuff really cheaply, and so he started to. He was collecting here, and New Zealanders who passed by were given things, and please take it back to Roger Duff at Canterbury Museum, and so these sorts of people, Johnny Johnson. Worked for the Friends Ambulance Unit from 45 to 47, and one of his jobs, he went. There was an oil refinery at a place called Jiayuguan, which is north of Shandan, and so Johnny Johnson drove from central China all the way up there to collect oil, and went through Shandan, and Ali gave him some objects. He gave him this pot and a few other things. And fortunately, he wrote in Johnson's diary what he was giving him and where he got it, where he found it. And Mrs. Johnson's still alive. And so she gave me the diary. And so we were able to actually identify where they, it's very handy because there's not much of that sort of material. And that came back to Canterbury Museum. In 1947, some of you I don't know if you remember this or have heard of this, another South Canterbury connection was that some local farmers donated 25 Corriedale sheep to the farm in Shandan. So the local sheep had poor wool. They were goats, I think, essentially. And Ali's idea was that if they could breed them with some New Zealand sheep, that they would increase the wool cut or whatever, they would get better wool. So New Zealand, some local farmers donated 25 sheep, and they were shipped up to China, and they arrived, and they were put out on the farm. And the man who took them was a man called Harry Seabright, and he was from Fairlie. Don't know if any of you know the name, but he was a Fairlie man. And Tekapo, he worked on a station in Tekapo as well, I think. And then when he came back, Ali gave him material, of course, to bring back, pots and bits and pieces, to bring back. Because how do you're collecting this stuff and you want to get it back to New Zealand? Well, it's only New Zealanders passing through who are returning home. This was the way of getting material back to New Zealand. So this worked, and the sheep were shorn, and an American Women's Association donated a weaving loom to the farm, or to the school, and the first clip of wool was weaved, and one of the objects was made was a rug, and that was brought back donated to New Zealand, and it was in the hands of, became the Chinese Friendship Association, the China Association, and now that's in Canterbury Museum as well. So that's kind of a special object. The woman who had it, I can't remember when it came to the museum, something like 1990, and the woman who had it, who was from the China Friendship Association, she kept cats, and which weren't always well disciplined, and so it does have a few stains on it. So that's a part of the history of the object. So that's that. Now the school farm. So James Beattie, who I've done this research with, and I have we visited Shandana, and we visited the site of the school farm. And when they were, it's about 6 kilometres out of town, a place called Sibatan, which is just out of town of Shandana. When they were digging the trenches for irrigation, they discovered a Neolithic site with Neolithic material, and they were digging away. The boys and Ali and some of his friends were, digging away, and they discovered these old pots and things. Apparently, that they did a sort of a rough recovery, but stuff got smashed because they would, it was important to get this irrigation done. Anyway, so some of the material was brought back to New Zealand. After 1949, the Chinese government, the local government, Langzhou, did a full archaeological work at this site and recognised a unique Neolithic culture, and it's called Siba culture, and now that's recognised as a particular cultural type, and it was actually Ali who originally discovered that site, haphazardly, but that was so. Some of these objects came back to Canterbury Museum. Other material from that area that was gifted at this time. That's actually that's a roof tile. That's a burial object, which is a model stove. They're not uncommon, so that's something which goes into the tomb, so you can do your cooking and keeps the spirit happy, and so that doesn't come out and cause problems. Now, until 1949, the New Zealand government supported the school, and so there was money coming. Come the Communist Revolution, of course, New Zealand government's not so prepared to send money to China, and neither are the Americans. And so it becomes really a funding issue, a big funding problem. And Ali has this idea of, and together with his family in New Zealand and New Zealand supporters, to stage exhibitions of the material that he's gifted back here, most of it to the museum, and also items which were made in the school by the school kids, in order to raise money. And there was an exhibition in Christchurch, for example, and that was followed by another South Canterbury connection, an exhibition in Waimate in July 1950. And it was held at the county chambers. The connection with Waimate seems to be Bernice Shackleton. I don't know if any of you know her. And she was the founder of the Rewi Aid Committee in Waimate in 1948, and it was connected with Corso. So that this aid committee, it was separate, but it was connected with Corso. So there were a number of these exhibitions held around the place. This one in Waimate was very successful. They claimed they had 900 visitors, and Waimate's population was 3,000 in those days. So we're talking about something like a third of the population came to the exhibition, and they raised £35, which is probably quite a lot of money in those days, for the Bailey School. And so we can identify quite a few of the items in here. There's no list, unfortunately. Roger Duff came down from the museum and opened the exhibition, and it was quite a big event for Waimate. I don't know if those county chambers are still, are they still standing? I don't know, but that was the exhibition. That there is interesting. That it's a tapestry, and it was given to Ali's mother, Clara Ali, from Sung Ching Ling, who was the wife of Sun Yat-sen, the first president. And so she gave that to Ali's mother, and then and that's it there, and it's now in Canterbury Museum. But that was in the exhibition as well. And here's from the Waimate Daily. The opening, nearly 100 very satisfied people attended the opening. There we are. And it was, it raised, as I said, £35 for Ali's school. So there we are. Now another South Canterbury connection, which I haven't got to the bottom of, is that a number of objects, this one included, and some other pictorial works, were loaned to William Hart Smith, who was an Australian literary figure. He was a poet, and he worked in Timaru in adult education. Anybody know about this? Do you remember him? I'll talk to you afterwards. Excellent, because I can't seem to get to the bottom of this chap.
I think he wrote poetry.
He was a poet,
Yeah,
correct.
He wrote one that I really loved.
Really? Yeah, no, he was a poet. He's actually in the Australian book biography thing online. He's on it. Anyway, he was a I don't know what about him, but he came to New Zealand just for a year or two, and there was something old about his marriage or something. And he worked in adult education, and he borrowed items from Canterbury Museum and brought them down here. But I don't know exactly if he had an exhibition, he was teaching Chinese material, I don't know. But there is this yet another connection with South Canterbury, which is interesting. Okay, so in 1952, Ali is told that he needs to come back, he has to leave his beloved, and actually, having studied Ali, they were the happiest years of his life, that time at the school. He was an educator, his family were educators, and he's kind of like, he was really in his element there. He started a school from scratch in these broken down old buildings, and he was a good New Zealander, and he built things and fixed things and got things going, and he was a good practical person, and anyway, so he was extremely reluctant to leave the school, but he was forced to. Came to Beijing. 1952, China it becomes the head of the world peace movement, takes over from the Soviet Union. And to herald this big movement, they hold this big peace conference. And Ali is in charge of getting the delegates to this conference. And so that's held in Beijing. And so there's Ali there. Most of these people are pretty lefty. They were union people and members of the Communist Party, etc. ones to point out, there's Courtney Archer. He was the one who had worked at the school, the Rangiora man. Archer's Millers. There was a big mill in Southbrook in Rangiora. So that's him there. There's Ali. That's W.H. Uren, who was a farmer from Hawke's Bay, who met Ali here for the first time. Ali suggested that he collect art and then exhibit it in order to promote China. He did it. Uren did it. He visited China here 52, again in 56, and again 60. Brought art, brought it back to New Zealand, and then exhibited it all around the North Island until he died. His last exhibition was in 1983. He continued to exhibit art. So that was him there. There's Ali. That's Margaret Garland, who was, again, Ali suggested she use art to promote China, and she did, and so interesting group of people. That's Willis Airy, who wrote the biography of Ali in 1970, 1972. He was an academic from Auckland. So they had this big conference, and Ali was the head of that. He stayed in China. He had been communicating with Roger Duff, who was the director of Canterbury Museum from 1948 until he died in his boots at the museum in 1978. Ali had been communicating him since the early 1940s, when Duff had started to work at the museum in the ethnology department. And Ali's material went into the ethnology department, and so that was Duff's area. Then they began, and Duff became the director, and many of you will remember him, and he started communicating with Ali. He was a very charismatic man, well-known sort of Canterbury identity. But he went to China. He had the chance to actually meet Ali in 1956. And this was the delegation that went to China in 1956 at the invitation, of course, of the Chinese government. You had to. To go to China in those days was, was extremely rare. My colleague James says that he's an historian, he says it was like going to the moon, it was like China was this cut-off country, communist, and people were interested to know what's actually happening, what's it like? And so the Communist Party would invite these sort of foreign delegations to come and give them these sort of guided tours and the wonderful magic of communism. So this was the New Zealand delegation that went. Unlike the 1952 delegation, this one was a broad range of people. It wasn't just sort of lefties. It was there were a range. So Ormond Wilson was the head of he led the delegation, and he was a substantial landowner from Manawatu. He had been a Labour MP once before the war and once after the war, but he was quite a wealthy man. He was an academic from Auckland. There's Roger Duff. He always had his tie tucked in, which is always, always recognisable. Evelyn Page, the painter. And that was Charles Hilgendorf. Now, old farmers know that name because of Hilgendorf wheat. So he was another Canterbury man, and he went to school with Ormond Wilson. And he later Sir Charles Hilgendorf. There's a Hilgendorf College at Lincoln, yeah. So that's Evelyn Page. That's Bertram. Charles Bertram? Oh, I've forgotten his name. Charles Bertram? Yeah, he was the Wellington, he was a professor of English at Wellington. Victoria nearly didn't let him go. He had trouble. He had to take leave without pay to be able to go. Victoria weren't going to let him go. The other is a Presbyterian minister. And that's that woman from the 52 delegation as well, Margaret Garland. She was an English woman. She was actually on the radio. She lived in Wellington. And she was on the radio, national radio, the equivalent in those days, YA network. And she was this one here, Ngaire Tapuna. She was from the Manawatu. Somebody fell out of the party, and Wilson she was a local primary school teacher. And so she was a sort of a late ring-in. Anyway, she and Geddes later married. Geddes' wife died, and he later married her, and they lived in Sydney. He moved from Auckland to Sydney and had a very successful career. He was an anthropologist. So they were the crew who went to China in 1956. And Eve Page painted, and we've tracked down quite a few paintings of that. Unfortunately, there's never been an exhibition. They're in different places. But there's some quite well-known paintings. Of course, Freddie Page was her husband, and they got a real interest in China, and Freddie Page worked in China teaching music. Some of you will recall a good picture. They got sort of, these delegations. This was not uncommon. They met Chairman Mao. Bertram had interviewed Chairman Mao in the 1930s, so it was sort of a bit of a meeting of old friends in a sense for 5 seconds that they had. They had a visit with Zhou Enlai, the premier, great man, and Duff. When Duff arrived in Beijing, Ali met them at the train station, and Ali immediately offered Duff. He had been collecting in Shandan since he was in Beijing. He was buying stuff, and Ali offered his entire collection to Duff. Said, "You can take the lot, and I'll start collecting again." And Duff, but the problem was there was a ban on exports of antiquities that came in 1950 because of the embarrassment of the previous, 2 centuries when Westerners had looted so much out of China. When the communists arrived, they said, "That's it. Nothing else is going." And so they had to. So he had this problem. He took Maori taonga with him. He took some panamu, etc., which he used as gifts. This is typical Duff stuff, And he gifted them, and he met with Huizong Chao, who was the director of the Palace Museum. That's the Forbidden City, the museum. It was the Imperial Palace Museum in those days. And he was also the Assistant Minister of Culture, so he was a very important man. And he used all his charm and gifts and to try and get around this export ban. Duff was a fascinating man, but a poor photographer. And unfortunately, so that's a typical photo of Ali at the antiquities, in the Lulichang, the antiquities market in Beijing. But of course, there's a cyclist going past, which is actually some people say, it's quite good, it's quite charming, really. That chap there, we know he was a life photographer, and he had been working in the Shandong Bailey School in American. Don Kemp was his name, and then he was on his way back to America. He had a terrible time when he got back to America, McCarthy period, and he had a dreadful time. The sad end. Anyway, Duff kept a very, very good diary, which we've published, and he said in his diary, Rewi rang, final approval received to send out his list of valuable originals, started at 3:30 with 2 men packing large collection already gathered, finished packing 3 large cases, 2 medium and 2 small. And so they got these antiquities out of China. When Duff arrived in Hong Kong, he was interviewed by the South China Morning Post and said it was Ali's ambition, Mr. Duff said, to see that at least one museum in New Zealand had a reasonable collection of Chinese cultural works of art, and he personally felt very grateful for the interest. And there was a lot of meeting on that tour. There was a lot of meeting with, they were given access to high levels, and the directors of museums and stuff. He wanted to meet them. He was introduced. This was a way of, cultural diplomacy, smoothing things, presenting a good face of modern China. So some quite good pictures like that. Some of the objects that he brought back. I mean, this is by Li Keren, who's like one of the really big names of 20th century Chinese painting, and the colophon, it's presented to Ali. And interestingly, it's not the only one. There are more. Courtney Archer's letters, for example, in one of the letters he wrote to Ali when he came back after 1952, and he kept correspondence with Ali throughout his life. Fascinating correspondence. And one of them he says, "What happened to those paintings by Li Keren that you were given? Any possibility of getting one down?" And one turned up at Sotheby's a few years ago. Same, the water buffalo boy, a colophon, to Ali, same thing. And fortunately, I had a student at Sotheby's who alerted me to it, ex-student, but she couldn't tell me who it was. They can't say, and she wouldn't tell me where it was from. I pleaded, who had it? It was, but obviously she couldn't tell me. So, some pretty interesting material. Now, Ali had this idea, and Duff agreed with him and worked on this together, that Chinese art could be used to promote the interests of China. In the early days, it was in the war against the Japanese. Then during the Civil War, to support the school, and then, of course, with 1949 and the Communist Revolution, to try to because this was the enemy. We fought against China. New Zealanders fought against China in the Korean War. Communism was a dirty word. Ali became a dirty word. He was this great man in the 1930s and 40s. He was this humanitarian worker. He was on Weet-Bix cards, And then, boy, did it turn around, and he became, the secrets. People were watching him. He wasn't allowed on the radio here. He was not the thing. But there were some people, of course, who supported them. And Roger Duff, interesting man, because he was the head of a big, publicly funded museum, but he supported Ali. So he sort of walked a fine line. Well, he supported China. And they had this idea of promoting China through art. The best thing we can do is to support China is to show its culture to people so that they can come to understand this great culture, and then they might be sympathetic for China. And Ali, of course, there was the peace work, but there was also recognition of China, official recognition, because nobody was recognizing China, least of all the New Zealand government. They recognised Taiwan, of course, and so there was, this fight for recognition, which went on. So Duff had this idea of having a hall dedicated to Chinese, mainly virtually all Chinese art at Canterbury Museum, a permanent hall, and for that he did some more exchanges. With Huizong, the man the director of the Palace Museum, he gifted 2 complete moa skeletons. Of course, Canterbury Museum was, largely moa were a big part of that collection, and exchanges. And so this from Pyramid Valley. He went up to Pyramid Valley in North Canterbury again, did some more digs, and sent off 2 moa skeletons. I finally tracked this one down at the National History Museum in Beijing. And it's still there, yeah, right? So it's on display. And Huizong sent, because Duff had this idea, we'll make a display as if it were a Chinese house and use Chinese furniture and show things in that way, as if they were in situ. And so Huizong sent Chinese furniture in exchange, and then Duff, it was all cultural diplomacy, cultural exchange. Duff finds 2 children. The museum was closed at this time because it was a rebuilding for the new Centennial block. But he got 2 children in to take a photo for the press, and showed them this furniture. Sent the cutting to Huizong, who wrote back and said, "I'm more than convinced than ever that the exchange of culture between our 2 countries could make us understand one another." Really soft diplomacy at work, this was it. And then they opened this permanent Hall of Oriental Art, it was called, in 1958. So this was part of the new Centennial wing. It was like this until the mid-90s, when that hall was redone, and it looks in a different way today. It's a different hang, as it were. But that was what it looked like. Fabulous, wasn't it? That was the original hall that was built. So that was the first dedicated space to East Asian art in Australasia by about 20 years. There was no permanent gallery dedicated to Asian art in Australia until the 70s. So it's quite extraordinary that happened in Little Christchurch, a permanent space dedicated to East Asian art. And that's Ali and Duff. So Ali visited again in 1960, and he didn't come down for the opening of the hall, but he visited in 1960, and he brought about 60 gifts with him, and some of them were actually very, very good quality, brought some interesting material. Then in 1964 he came again, but things had got tighter, and it got more difficult, and he wasn't allowed to bring anything original. So it was no more antiquities. And so they were copies that he brought. So he brought copies in 1964. After this time, of course, this is the Cultural Revolution, Ali's sort of virtual house arrest. He produces an enormous amount of propaganda for the Chinese, for the CCP, and he's sort of like housebound. Eventually, of course, December 1972, New Zealand, following Australia's lead, recognises the government in Beijing. And so that's that huge, this is what, these people here, China Friendship Society, which Ali was completely instrumental in starting in the early 1950s. Duff was the first chairman of the Christchurch branch. Courtney Archer was the secretary. These were the people. And 1972, we have the recognition of China, of the Beijing government. And Ali, sort of the things peter out. The odd thing still comes to Canterbury Museum. But now it's more sort of Ali focused. It's about him, his person, as opposed to Chinese culture. And so the odd thing still trickles down. So, for example, on his 85th birthday, these seals that were given by the government here. Oh, sorry, the seals were given in the 90s, the medal. And that brings us to what you've got here. So I think it's quite interesting that these came in 1973. So this is immediately following the recognition of the Peking government. Now that's kind of interesting because I wonder whether in a sense, the work of some people who were involved in that, perhaps the work of that association in a sense was done. The reason for having these to promote China, to promote and to try and show the positive face of China in a sense for the recognition, for official recognition, perhaps that work was done. And so it's interesting that it was 1973 that they disposed of them, brought them and gave them here. I don't know. You've got two good pictures, and I'm sorry, this is the first time I've seen this picture, so I can't tell you a lot about it. But it's interesting that the two pictures you've got, and I haven't even got a photo of the other one. You've got this one, which is over there, and we should probably, and that's what's written on the other one. Here it is here. It's by Luo Chen, or his other name, Qing Chao, and he was a Qing dynasty painter who was also a poet from modern-day Guangxi province. What's interesting is that you've got here examples, and I suspect this is you've got examples of two major traditions of Chinese painting: the academic tradition and the literati tradition. So let me just tell you briefly about what that is. The academic tradition is the tradition that was founded by professional painters at the court. It was a courtly tradition, and they used colour and detail, and it's associated with courtly culture. Very, very, very beautiful pictures. So these two pictures are by the Emperor Huizong from the Song dynasty. And this is classic. highly detailed, each feather's painted in, takes ages to paint, very, very difficult. So this is the sort of realm of professional painters, very, very time consuming. And here's another Huizong painting, those auspicious cranes. And so, for example, this one, you know, he would have used rulers and, what do you call those things for doing circles? You know, with a hot one. What do you call them? Compasses. You know, compasses, things like that, right? So that's, you know, very finely done, and you can't see the details, but you know, it's absolutely beautiful, and each eye of the bird, and it's just, it's really meticulous. It will take ages and ages. So that's what we call the academic tradition, and it's colourful. The other tradition is the Literati tradition, and this started in the Tang dynasty and really evolved during the Song dynasty. So we're talking about the 900s, 1011s. And so beginning back earlier, and this uses just sumi ink, black ink, just monochrome ink, and it specializes in particularly like landscapes and plants, and it becomes like the interest is in what they called ink play. That is, just the paintings are executed quickly, right? It's in monochrome, and the interest is in the brushwork. With the academic tradition, you can't see the brushwork. It's also finely detailed. The brushwork is sort of obliterated in a sense. This is the action of the painter, as it were. And it's very closely associated with calligraphy, which was the major, in fact really still is the major art form. And the calligraphers had recognized that the use of the brush can be expressive, that there is the potential for expressing yourself through the brush. It doesn't matter what you're writing, but it's how it's written. And the painters took on that idea because it's the same brush, it's the same paper, whatever, right? It's the same material. And it's this ink play. So kind of simple pictures. So these are great literati figures from the Song dynasty, Mi Fei here. You know, really exciting calligraphy. And this intimate connection between calligraphy and painting. And his son, Mi Yuren. And what you've got here is you've got examples of each tradition. You've got a really nice piece of scholarly literati painting, and then you've got a colourful painting which comes directly from that academic tradition. Now, my suspicion is that and it's typical of Ali, and I don't know how the China Association got these pictures. I would love to know, find out, but it's typical that it would be one of each, because this represents the two great major traditions of painting in China in sort of a broad sense. So for education, I could spend, you know, several lectures with my students just with those two pictures, talking about these traditions, right, and how they evolved, because it's really good, you know, good examples to be able to teach about painting in China. There's lots of other traditions, lots of other types of, you know, obviously, but these are two major sort of traditions. So, should we have a look at those, Hamish? Can we have a look at those pictures? And my work has been done with Associate Professor James Beattie, who's at Victoria University, and we were helped by a Marsden grant. And that's that's the end of the official part of the talk. So should we go and have a look at the pictures? Thanks, everybody. Thanks for being so attentive. Oh, are there any questions before we sort of break up a wee bit? Yes?
Really, what was his opinion relationship with Mao Zedong or with Chiang Kai-shek?
Yeah, well, he was not a great supporter of Chiang Kai-shek. He was a supporter of Mao. Yeah, so he was never a member of the Communist Party, because the Communist Party, though he was more, I think the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, he was more useful as not a member, and he was always a supporter, huge supporter. Right from early days, and he worked as a propagandist for the Communist Party for years. So he was he was naturally huge sympathiser. Yeah. So he was one of the few foreigners, there were very, very few foreigners who stayed in China right through, you think, 1927 to 1987. I mean, that is incredible. That's 60 years through that period of Chinese history, and he lived there, he stayed there.
When he went to Beijing, what did he do with it?
He was a peace worker. So he was employed by the government as a peace ambassador. The China, head of the World Peace Movement. He was given a house, he had a driver, he had a cook, quite a good stipend. It was not uncomfortable. We have letters, him writing home and saying, oh, how can I lose weight? You know, I'm putting on so much weight, how can I lose it? And this is at a time when people are starving, you know. So it wasn't an uncomfortable life that he led. But and at the same time, it wasn't desperately, you know, because he would toe the line. Yeah.
Was it 1927 when he went home, not
Yes.
1929?
27. Definitely 27. It was 27 to 87. Yeah. Yeah.
He died in China.
He died in Beijing. And you remember Longy visited. Muldoon visited. And Muldoon, a good story, this one. Muldoon, Muldoon, when he went to Beijing, the people at the embassy said, oh, you know, we're having a reception. You have to invite, you know, you have to invite Ali. No, not having Ali. No, not having, you know, they wouldn't even. And they said we have to have, you know, all right. Anyway, so when Ali arrived in the you know, the lineup, the two men met and they hit it off, and they talked all night. It's quite funny, yeah, because Ali was charismatic, obviously, extremely charismatic man, and they hit it off. I think they might have been similar in some ways, yeah. And then Longy visited, you might remember, and famously said, you know, New Zealand has many great sons, but you are the greatest. Remember that? Because you know what Longy was like. So yeah, he died in Beijing. Yeah. Any other questions? So there was one at the yeah.
How long after he went to China did he come to prominence back in New Zealand in terms of?
In the 30s, in the work with Indisco and the industrial cooperatives movement. So he became a humanitarian. He was really picked up by the American press. There was a big article in the Saturday Evening Post by Snow. What's Snow's first name? Edgar. Yeah, that's it. And he wrote a piece on Ali, and I think it was on the front page of the Saturday Evening Post, and that really propelled that international. And that was part of it was again because he wanted to get funds from the Americans, and so that was, and I think that helped really propel him. So it was the second half of the 30s. Yeah, but New Zealand were huge supporters of that school, Waimate, you know. I mean, it came to everywhere, yeah.
So where was he born?
Springfield. And then the family, after a few months, the family moved to Amberley, and then he was there for, I think, 5 years, and then they shifted into Christchurch.
And then he worked in the North Islands.
Taranaki, that was after the First War, so he went to, yeah.
Springfield. Oh, I've got to read it, isn't it?
Yeah, sorry?
Sometime between 1920 and 1927, he came back down here and he worked at the Perrier Freezing Works. And he boarded with my mother's family.
Did he really? Well, I didn't know that. And maybe it was just before he went to China. Yeah, I've forgotten. Yeah, okay, interesting. It must have been just for a short time, was it, before he went to China? Yeah, interesting.
Does he still have family relations here?
Sorry?
He has family relations still in...
Oh, yeah. Oh, there are lots of Allies. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Elizabeth Alley on the radio. She's retired, but she was... Liz Alley, remember her? Yeah. No, there's lots of Allies around. Yeah. Yeah, it's quite a big family. Yeah. Okay, any other questions? Okay, shall we wander over and look at the pictures?